Welcome to the Adams County Historical Society and its online programs. My name is Antigone Ladd. Our guest today is Robert Hilliard, best-selling author in a wide-ranging field from history to sports to the out-of-doors. Rob began his career as a journalist with the Pittsburgh Tribune and has written extensively for over 30 years. His most recent book, In Freedom's Shadow, is historical fiction focusing on the role of Civil War espionage and tells the story of escaped slave John Scobell and his adventures becoming a Pinkerton spy and traveling through the South to gather information. The book is beautifully written. In April 2024, this book, In Freedom's Shadow, won an International Firebird Book Award as the top African-American fiction entry. I'd like to start our program by asking Rob, as a journalist, I know you've done extensive research for your various publications. How did you decide to do research in a field as secretive as the spy business? Where are you going to find research on people who didn't write about the work they did, nor about the people that they worked with? I mean, it's a daunting subject to dive into, much less one that's over 150 years past, so there's no one around that you can question.
It's an excellent question. Part of the answer to that might have been I just didn't know any better and didn't know enough to realize what a stupid idea that was at the outset. But there are really a couple genuine answers to the question. One is when I first read about the story of John Scobell, I was so inspired by it that I'll talk about a bit more in the presentation. But I really, that was a driving force I just wanted to tell the story. Another piece of it was, although virtually everything I'd written up to that point was nonfiction, I did at first conceive this as a nonfiction book, but then I realized that there just wasn't enough background information about Scobell to write the kind of in-depth nonfiction that I would have wanted to write. But in the back of my head, I had also always had the idea that I might write a novel if I found the right subject. And when I started researching Scobell, I started to think he might be the right subject. You make a great point that spies by their nature are secretive. In fact, they rely on it for their very existence. So it wasn't easy to ferret out the information that was needed. And in some cases, which is why it was a novel, I had to fudge a little bit to fill in the gap. So one of the things I did that you might find interesting is I took what was known and, like I said, tried to fill in the gaps. You end up, when you're doing a book like this, you end up researching the goofiest things, like what were the sidewalks in Richmond made out of during the Civil War, so that you could say if somebody's walking on the sidewalk, did their boots clump on the wood, or were they cobblestone, or what, like goofy things, or what did table settings look like during the Civil War? All kinds of goofy stuff. But there's not a lot, to your point, on what were the spy techniques of the time. There were a few. They talked a little bit about how people were interviewed, how they pumped them for information, which is a term that we still use today, or how people might dress up in disguise. And that was not exactly Mission Impossible, by the way, where they would peel off a rubber mask at the end. Their disguises were not quite that sophisticated in the 19th century. But what I did do to try and fill those gaps was take more modern techniques and digital technology and cell phones and cars and all the things that didn't exist in the middle 1800s. What would that same technique look like if you spun back 150 years? And then, because what we forget sometimes is spying wasn't invented. It's sometimes referred to as the second oldest profession. It wasn't invented in the 20th century, certainly not even in the 19th. It dates back tens of thousands of years. And but I wanted to give people an idea that these techniques were used, but they were just used minus the technology that we're familiar with today. So anyway, that's kind of a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but really, like I said, I was inspired by John Scobell and his story. That's what made me want to do it. I realized there wasn't enough, the pool wasn't deep enough to write the kind of nonfiction book that I would have wanted to. So I went with a novel. And then, as I said, I tried to use I used what was known about Scobell and the time period, and then to use real espionage techniques, but rewind them back to 19th century
Fantastic.
technology.
Okay. Well, why don't we dive into your slideshow now, which gives us a broad overview of the spying business in the Civil War, how it evolved, and who were the key players in it. And I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Antigone, for inviting me here today to talk about spies, slaves, and secrets of the Civil War. As we go through the presentation, we'll discuss the reasons why there were so many spies in place during the Civil War, how intelligence gathering evolved for both sides throughout the war, the emerging technology of espionage in the 1860s, and the development of ciphers and codes. Then we'll name some names. We'll kind of run through a who's who of Civil War spies for both the Union and the Confederacy. In particular, we'll talk about the contributions of Black Americans, especially escaped slaves, to the collection of intelligence for the Union cause. So let's jump in. We'll start the discussion of Civil War espionage by talking about a more recent conflict, one that most of us will be familiar with and that some of us are old enough to remember firsthand. The Cold War, as the name indicates, was one with minimal face-to-face fighting. Instead, its basis was largely in spying. The Cold War saw the formation of the CIA in the United States, the Stasi secret police in East Germany, and the massive growth of other spy agencies such as MI6 in the UK and the KGB in the Soviet Union. One of the reasons these spy networks came into existence as they did had its basis in geography. At the close of World War II, the Soviet armies came into Germany from the east as they came across from Russia and through Poland, and the Allied armies swept in from the west as they came in, of course, after D-Day and came up through France. When the Soviets suddenly declared after the close of World War II that people would no longer be able to pass from east to west Germany and vice versa, the Iron Curtain fell. Nearly overnight, Germany was one country divided into two, with an extended, armed, distinct border dividing it in half, being guarded by soldiers and artillery. And that, of course, became known as the infamous Iron Curtain. Because that happened so quickly, people who had loyalties that lay with the government on the other side of the border from where they lived were suddenly trapped on what was to them the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. People with communist allegiances were stuck in West Germany, and people who leaned towards capitalist or more democratic ideals were trapped in East Germany. A few of those people eventually found ways to escape and get over to the other side, but others stayed where they were and became spies in place, passing information back and forth across the Iron Curtain. If we look at the United States a little over 100 years earlier, we see that it was a very similar situation. When the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, the United States was instantly one nation divided into two. Like Germany a century later, that division consisted of an extended armed border guarded by armed soldiers and artillery. Just like the German citizens along the Iron Curtain, people who had loyalties that lay with the government on the other side, north or south in this case, from where they lived, were suddenly trapped on the wrong side. And just like their Cold War counterparts, many of these people elected to stay where they were and serve the government where their loyalties lay instead of where they lived. Die-hard secessionists stayed in the North and passed on secrets to the South, and fervent abolitionists who lived in the South remained there and found ways to share important intelligence reports with the Union Army in the North. If we zoom in a little bit closer, the comparisons really still continue to line up. When Germany was divided in half, its capital city of Berlin was also split in two, famously divided along the line you can see here in the middle of the screen by the Berlin Wall. Almost overnight, there were two opposing capital cities immediately adjacent to each other. Again, the division created by the wall resulted in many people with opposing views living on the other side from where their allegiances lie. So many of these people undertook espionage activities, and because there were so many of them who did, Berlin eventually earned the moniker the City of Spies. So again, spinning back a century earlier, if we look at this image entitled The Map of the Seat of the War, we see that the sudden division between the North and the South at the outset of the Civil War, and shortly after that, the movement of the Confederate capital to the city of Richmond in Northern Virginia, Central Virginia, I guess, really, in May of 1861, left these two warring nations with capitals only about 100 miles apart. You can see Washington, D.C. in the north and Richmond down here to the south. I particularly like this map being described as the seat of the war. And I just wanted to take an extra second here to point out a few locations that people will recognize. You can see some of the famous battle sites of the Civil War here, starting with Harper's Ferry in the north, Front Royal, all just west of Washington, D.C., and then, of course, Fredericksburg and Petersburg down here in the south. And I'll also touch on, just for geographic reference, the Peninsula Campaign of the spring of 1862 a little bit later, and that's essentially coming up this peninsula here towards Richmond. Zooming in a bit, you can get a closer look here and see that it wasn't quite the same situation as Berlin, where you had a single city divided in half, but the distance from Washington to Richmond is only about 100 miles. And just for comparison, that's about a third of the distance between London and Paris, France, just to use an example of two cities who famously have been at war many times over the centuries. So they're very close together, and again, immediately divided in the middle. Essentially, these two warring capitals were split by only about 100 miles and two river crossings. This proximity left both cities vulnerable to clandestine agents who gathered intelligence from the opposing side and allowed vital information to be passed across enemy lines quickly and sometimes surprisingly easily. So what were the intelligence gathering capabilities of each side at the outbreak of the Civil War? The source of the following information is from the CIA website. So I feel obligated to say that if you notice any shadowy figures following you down the street, or you hear strange clicking noises in the background of your phone conversations after watching this presentation, I take absolutely no responsibility for that whatsoever. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's review a CIA monograph called Intelligence in the Civil War. Among many observations in this essay, it highlights the following points about espionage capabilities at the outset of the war. On the Union side, there was no intelligence agency or network in place when the Civil War started. The U.S. at that time, or up to that time, had been very much an isolationist country. They hadn't been at war since the Mexican-American War, which was nearly 2 decades earlier. They just didn't feel the need to have an in-place intelligence agency for gathering, for spying. So that was, of course, they immediately recognized the need for it, and shortly after the outbreak of the war, eventually established what was called the Bureau of Military Information. That was the agency charged with gathering spy intelligence and disseminating it to the Union Army. Within the Bureau of Military Information, or the BMI, agents reported to specific generals rather than to the federal government as a whole, or to the lead general of the federal army. This was kind of an unusual situation, and it did at times create confusion because you had multiple people reporting to multiple different people, and sometimes different information got passed up the chain of intelligence. On the Confederate side, of course, there was no intelligence agency or network at the beginning of the Civil War either. They fairly quickly established what was called the Signal Corps, and within that, it included a covert agency called the Secret Service Bureau. That agency ran espionage operations into the North, and later in the war, they established an office in Canada and ran espionage operations into the northern states. The article also makes another important observation. While both sides still used tried and true techniques such as code breaking and covert surveillance, technological advances of the era brought two new espionage tactics into play. One of these was wiretapping, and the other was overhead scouting. Now, you might be asking yourself, how were they able to do airborne scouting during the Civil War? They obviously didn't have modern techniques like drones or satellites, and they were about 50 years too early from even the very earliest airplanes. So the answer to that question is, of course, lighter than air. Overhead reconnaissance in the Civil War was conducted by balloons. This had been done in earlier wars in Europe, most notably by the French military. But the U.S. Civil War marked the first time they were used in any large-scale way in full concert with the military tacticians on the ground. As shown in the illustration here, the reconnaissance balloons were floated above the battlefield with an observer in the basket. They were tethered to the ground so they didn't drift away from the fight, or worse, into enemy territory. Using field glasses, or what we would call binoculars, or a telescope, as shown in the illustration here, they could observe the number and placement of enemy troops, as well as the topography and cover on the other side of the battlefield. When the observer signaled to the soldiers on the ground below, the balloon's handlers would haul on the ropes to tug it lower so that the observer could get close enough to the ground that he could shout down and report what he had seen. Balloons were mostly used by the Federal Army during the Civil War. Their balloon corps was headed by a man named Thaddeus Lowe, and they were in active use from the fall of 1861 until Lowe's resignation in the summer of 1863. Unfortunately, balloons were often plagued by things like poor weather, wind, storms during battles. It made a lot of difficulty for them. And also there were difficult logistics in getting the deflated balloons to and from the battlefield. They also made exceptionally large and inviting targets for the opposing army to fire at. As rifles and ammunition improved during the course of the war, spy balloons could more easily be shot full of holes from an ever-increasing distance. You can kind of even see that shown in the illustration here, where it appears that they're drawn to be firing at the balloon. This was obviously a major problem, and one of many that ultimately led to the balloon corps being abandoned near the middle point of the war. A substantially more impactful technology that firmly took hold during the Civil War was the telegraph. It was invented less than 20 years prior, and the telegraph allowed near instantaneous transmission of information from near the battlefield to as far away as Washington, D.C. For the first time in military history, a commander-in-chief hundreds of miles from the front could receive military intelligence in just minutes. There were thousands of miles of permanent and temporary telegraph lines strung during the war. As shown in the image here of General Grant, riders would bring information from the front that was immediately transcribed, analyzed by the generals at their headquarters, and then sent out via telegraph to places like Washington, D.C., where President Lincoln was an avid reader of telegrams from the front. At this time period, mobile communications, essentially the cell phones of their day, consisted of a telegraph machine and an operator tucked into the back of a wagon and moved from place to place near the battlefield. As you can see here, a temporary line was run from the wagon to the nearest pole. From there, it was connected along other temporary lines until tying into a permanent telegraph line, which might have been miles away. Of course, miles and miles of telegraph lines meant even greater opportunities for counter-espionage. And in this case, that consisted of tapping the telegraph lines. So when you find out your lines are being wiretapped, what do? You counter with counterintelligence, in this case, by using codes. This is a snippet of a letter from Union Spy Chief Alan Pinkerton, who we'll talk more about later, that shows the substitution code that he developed early in the Civil War for the Union Army. At the outset of the war, the Union was using this simple substitution system to encode its messages, which swapped words from the column on the right in place of words in the column on the left in telegrams that were being sent by Pinkerton operatives. For example, if an operative wanted to send a message about a Confederate infantry unit they'd seen drilling in a certain location, they might say something like lamps rosin oil, hand lamp, and then the location. If you knew the code words, you could decode that as military, foot, drill, which would indicate a drilling infantry unit at that location. At the same point in the war, the Confederates were using a somewhat more complicated cipher system in which individual letters were replaced with other letters or symbols, which is what you see here. This image was taken from an actual letter written in cipher by secessionist spy Rose Greenhow, who we'll talk about more later as well. Unlike the Union substitution code, which could be decoded by memorizing the substitute words, the Confederate cipher required a specific tool to decipher the code. One of the commonly used tools they used was a cipher disk like this one, which is on display at the U.S. Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. As you can see, there are two concentric circles on the cipher disk. The inner circle spins to align the letters with the letters in the outer circle in different combinations. To cipher or decipher a message, a spy only had to know how to align the two disks. For example, you might align the inner letter A with the outer letter F. Then substitute each letter in their message, which was being written in the outer circle letters, replace that with the letters in the realigned inner circle, and voila, you have a ciphered letter written in code. To anyone without the cipher disk, the enciphered message would just look like a gibberish mix of random letters. But someone with a cipher disk in hand could unscramble that same message in a matter of minutes. Even if they didn't know which letters to align to start decoding, it would only take a little bit of trial and error to figure that out if you had the cipher disk in hand. So let's take a few moments to unmask some of the more well-known, or in some cases notorious, spies of the Civil War. And we'll start with ladies first. This is Elizabeth Van Lew. Van Lew was a member of Richmond's upper crust society prior to the war. Unlike other rich Southerners, though, she had strong abolitionist beliefs. Over the course of the war, Van Lew organized and ran her own spy network in Richmond on behalf of the Union. She freed her slaves prior to the war, but relied on them to keep up the pretext of slavery so they could gather intelligence around the city. Elizabeth even helped organize an escape of Union prisoners from a Confederate prison late in the war. One of the servants who worked for her was Mary Bowser. She had been a servant in the Van Lew home, was freed, and then sent to Philadelphia to be educated. When the war broke out, Mary came back to the Van Lew home, and Elizabeth was able to place her through her connections in Richmond society as a servant in the Confederate White House in Richmond. When Mary was there, she acted as just another ignorant slave who couldn't read or write when in fact she could. And in that role, she was able to read and memorize papers and plans that were sitting on the desk right out in the open in the office of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. She brought that information back to Van Lew, who in turn sent it to her Federal Army contacts in the North. So you may not have heard of Van Lew and Bowser before today, but you probably will be hearing more soon. They are both slated to be featured in an upcoming series on Paramount called The Gray House, which is produced by two names you probably have heard, Morgan Freeman and Kevin Costner. I don't think they're going to be playing Van Lew and Bowser, but they are producing the show. So another female spy to talk about was Pauline Cushman. Pauline was an actress who spied for the Union while traveling across the South during the Civil War. Her career allowed her to travel freely from town to town without being questioned about why she wanted to be or needed to be in a certain location. And it also provided her access to the people who could afford to go to a show, which tended to be some of the more wealthy or in the loop type of people within the Confederacy. So Pauline collected intelligence on troop locations that she saw during her travels and also reported on various bits of gossip that she picked up from Confederate officers who attended her shows. One of the more notorious spies on behalf of the Confederacy during the war was Belle Boyd. Belle became known as the Cleopatra of the South. I have to be honest, in looking at her picture, I'm not exactly sure why, but Maybe the picture just doesn't do her justice. We'll leave that at that. Bell was from what was then Western Virginia, which is now West Virginia. And even though that was an area that refused to secede along with the rest of the state at the outbreak of the war, Bell still had very strong Southern sympathies that she maintained. She supposedly provided information to the Confederates prior to the First Battle of Bull Run and later to Stonewall Jackson prior to the battle at Front Royal. While she may have passed on some useful information at some point, Bell is really known more for bragging about being a spy than any real successes in the field of espionage. Now, as a counterpart to that, someone who was, at least at the outset of the war, a very successful Confederate spy, was successful as defined by collecting important information and passing it to the South, was Rose Greenhow. Rose lived in Washington, D.C., but like the people we talked about earlier, after the outbreak of the war, was trapped on, to her, the wrong side of the line. And she maintained very strong Southern sympathies. So what she did was gathered information from the influential people that she knew within Washington, D.C. society circles. Some of these included Union officers and even at least one U.S. senator. Allegedly, Rose used her feminine wiles to gather this information and then pass it along to her Confederate government contacts via enciphered messages like the one we saw earlier. In 1861, Rose was trapped and arrested by Allen Pinkerton, but she still continued to sneak messages out of her cell in Castle Thunder Prison in Washington. She even sometimes used her daughter, who's shown in the image here, to help smuggle those messages out. Now, of course, the most well-known female spy, at least during the Civil War, was Harriet Tubman. Tubman had been an Underground Railroad conductor prior to the war, and after the war broke out, she recruited and led a team of at least 8 Black men who were active spies in the Confederacy during the war. Tubman used the same network that she had built prior to the war to help slaves escape to feed information out, well, to gather information first off, and then feed it out to the North. She gathered intelligence from slaves that she was helping escape, and then also from some of those who were still in captivity when she herself was traveling. So if you've noticed as I'm running through here that there were a lot of female spies during the war, you're correct. There are a lot of reasons for this, including the geographic situation that we discussed earlier. However, another important factor was the prevailing attitude toward women at the time. They were considered to be the weaker sex, both in body and mind. Many, if not most, of the men in the 19th century assumed that women wouldn't be smart enough to understand the details of warfare, nor clever enough to gather the intelligence and share it with the opposing army. But, as I've already talked about here, those assumptions were 100% wrong. So moving on to the gentlemen, here's a quick sampling, or maybe a rogues gallery, of Civil War spies from both sides. So keep in mind again that on the Union side, the spy masters that I'm talking about here reported directly to individual generals rather than to the Army as a whole or to the War Department. As a result, there are several who overlap in their service, which did at times create confusion and some misinformation within the Union ranks. The first here is George Sharp, who reported to Meade and then later General Grant beginning in 1863 and through the end of the war. Sharp was one of the most effective federal intelligence officers. He understood the need to gather intelligence and pass it on quickly so that it was still fresh and actionable by the Army officers who were getting it. He also understood that some things needed to be filtered out, which was something that some of the earlier spy masters during the war didn't get straight. So they were passing along a lot of what was ultimately useless information. Sharp was very good about honing in on what was important and, again, what would be actionable by the Army, filtering that out and passing on only that information. He was particularly instrumental in gathering intelligence at Gettysburg, and then perhaps even more importantly, during Grant's final campaign through Virginia, which ultimately ended the war. Another Union spy master was Lafayette Baker. Early in the war, Baker reported directly to Winfield Scott, but then after Scott retired, he reported directly to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. So, sort of like Bell Boyd earlier, Baker was really a self-promoter. And he probably talked more about succeeding as a spy than he actually succeeded as a spy. He's probably most well known for assisting in the search for John Wilkes Booth after the Lincoln assassination, although ultimately he wasn't part of the team that captured or that shot Booth. So a Confederate spy to highlight here is Frank Stringfellow. And you can kind of see a little bit from the photo here. Stringfellow was so small and very slight and sickly that when he initially volunteered to serve in the Confederate Army at the beginning of the war, he was denied. Later, as the Confederate Army became more depleted, they started accepting more and more people and less restrictions. So he was allowed to volunteer, but they were still worried that he was too small to carry a rifle and a rucksack into battle. So instead, they determined to use him as a spy. One of the more interesting missions with Stringfellow was where he posed as a woman to go behind Union lines on a spying mission. And obviously, this is a case where his smaller size served as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. The next Union spy that I'd like to focus on is a name that people will probably recognize, Allan Pinkerton. And this is a photo of Pinkerton in the field at the Antietam battlefield. Hopefully you'll recognize the gentleman here in the middle in the stovepipe hat is Abraham Lincoln. And the gentleman on the right is General John McClernand. Pinkerton was the founder of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which became world famous. It was founded around 1850 in Chicago. He actually had some involvement in espionage prior to the Civil War when he identified what became known as the Baltimore plot, which was a plot to attempt to assassinate Lincoln during his travel to Washington for the inauguration. Pinkerton was brought in then a few months later, after the war broke out, by General George McClellan. The two had a relationship prior to the Civil War. And effectively, as I talked about earlier, there was no intelligence agency in place. So just like we might do today, McClellan brought Pinkerton in as a government contractor. They needed someone to fill that role. There wasn't anything intact to fill it at the beginning of the war. So they really just bought up the Pinkerton Agency, lock, stock, and barrel, picked them up from Chicago, moved them to Washington, D.C., and put Pinkerton and his operatives in place as government contractors. Pinkerton continued to report to McClellan until the latter's dismissal as the general of the Army of the Potomac in late 1862. Pinkerton was, as I like to say, an exceptional, groundbreaking detective. He was kind of a middling spy master, and he was a terrible writer. Pinkerton did manage to build an effective spy network, and again, really starting from nothing. That network was, over the course of about a year, able to gather critical information and to identify really most of the Confederate troops that were in the field in Virginia. But he was frequently criticized for inflating opposing troop numbers at the behest of McClellan, who then sometimes inflated them again before he passed that information on to Lincoln. Pinkerton was, in his intelligence gathering efforts, the first to begin questioning escaped slaves, whom he called black dispatches, to find out about conditions behind Confederate lines. The escaped slaves were obviously incentivized to help the Union Army, but they also often had fresh information on Confederate troop placements and sizes because they'd been there in person only a day or two prior. This is very similar to how modern armies would question or do question civilian refugees who cross from behind enemy lines onto their side of the battlefield. Again, it can be a very valuable source of information and one that the Army doesn't have access to otherwise. Some of these black dispatches so impressed Pinkerton that he recruited them to become more than just passive sources of military intelligence reporting. These select few became active spies for the Union and were sent on clandestine missions behind Confederate lines. One of the spies who served as a Pinkerton operative during the Civil War was Timothy Webster. He was one of the more well-known agents at that time and went on multiple spying trips to the Confederacy, posing as a Southern sympathizer who was living in the North. Because he assumed this role, Webster was often entrusted to carry covert messages from the South to the North, which were duly handed over to Pinkerton to be read and copied before being carried on and delivered to their intended recipient. In effect, Webster was a double agent. He was thought to be serving the Confederate intelligence gathering efforts, when in fact he was doing so for the Union. Another Pinkerton operative who was successful in gathering important information very early in the war was Price Lewis. He worked in Western Virginia in some of the battles there in the spring of 1861. Again, was very successful and provided helpful information to the Union armies in those areas. Later, he spied for Pinkerton in Richmond and was involved in Webster's final spying mission there as well. So perhaps the most well-known Black dispatch that Pinkerton encountered was a man named John Scobell, or sometimes you may hear his name pronounced Scobell. We don't really know how it's pronounced because it's only in writing now, and we're a century and a half removed. Scobell was an escaped slave who came to Pinkerton's office to be interviewed and find out what he knew about what he had seen behind Confederate lines. And he so impressed Pinkerton with his intelligence and his personality, and not to mention his ability to read and write, which was highly unusual for a slave at that time because it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. So he impressed Pinkerton so much that Pinkerton recruited him to become an active spy and one of his operatives. Scobell was sent on at least 2 covert missions behind Confederate lines that we know of. On the first, he traveled down the eastern shore of Maryland into Virginia with Webster, then circled back up through northern Virginia, gathering intelligence on Confederate positions, troop placements, troop sizes, and artillery positions. On his second mission, Scobell accompanied another Pinkerton agent who posed as his master, while the two were undercover in the Confederate capital of Richmond. Another monograph from the CIA website, and I feel compelled to point out that I don't do all of my web surfing on the CIA website, but I do a lot of it there. So that's why I'm frequently referencing. But this monograph was entitled Black Dispatches, and as you can see here, Black American Contributions to Union Intelligence During the Civil War. That article describes Scobell's espionage work as follows. Scobell is credited with providing valuable intelligence on Confederate order of battle, status of supplies, and troop morale and movements. Frequently, while the white Pinkerton agents elicited information from Confederate officials and officers, Scobell would seek out leaders in the Black community and collect their information on local conditions, fortifications, and troop dispositions. Another quote from this paper that I really like is from Frederick Douglass. In fact, I liked it so much that I included it at the beginning of In Freedom's Shadow. This quote reads, "The true history of the war will show that the loyal army found no friends at the South so faithful, active, and daring in their efforts to sustain the government as the Negroes. Negroes have repeatedly threaded their way through the lines of the rebels, exposing themselves to bullets to convey important information to the loyal Army of the Potomac." Now, surprisingly, one of the people who agreed with Douglass in this assessment was Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Lee's statement, which I also included at the beginning of my book, says, "The chief source of information to the enemy is through our Negroes." Now, it doesn't sound like Lee appreciated that quite as much as Douglass did, and his statement on it was a little bit more concise, but they did come to similar conclusions nonetheless. So I first discovered John Scobell and his story when I stumbled onto the Black Dispatches article that we talked about on the previous slide on the CIA website. In researching him further, I found that the basis of everything that we know about Scobell was a book entitled The Spy of the Rebellion, written by Allan Pinkerton in 1883. A number of historians have researched and written about Scobell over the past 160 years, and that includes this article by Alan Foster from the December 1963 edition of Ebony magazine, as well as this Pan-Horizon card from 1979. So some of the viewers of the show here who are a little closer to my age may remember these cards. They were spurred by all the interest in U.S. history that stemmed from the bicentennial celebrations in 1976. I bought this particular one on eBay a couple years ago. And on the back of the card, it has a write-up about Scobell and his exploits. But all of that information is, again, taken from the Pinkerton book. The fact that the Spy of the Rebellion is the sole primary source about Scobell has raised some questions over the years. For one, people have questioned whether he was in fact a real person at all, or maybe just a product of Pinkerton's imagination. Unfortunately for modern researchers, as I said earlier, Pinkerton was a terrible writer, and the way he wrote caused a lot of confusion. He had people appearing in different places at the same time. He desperately needed an editor. But another approach that he used, which created confusion, was that he had a habit of changing the names of his operatives when he wrote about them, or at least the operatives whose names didn't become well known for other reasons through the course of the war. This has confounded researchers for more than a century, including those who tried to research Scobell. Assuming he was a real person, John Scobell was born into slavery, meaning there would likely be no documentation of his existence, no birth certificate, certainly no Social Security card or anything like that. Then, as an adult, he became a spy, meaning he had to live in secrecy just to stay alive. And then again, decades later, his only biographer very probably used a fake name when writing about him. As a result, the details of Scobell's life remain veiled in mystery and very likely will remain that way forever. That said, most modern historians and espionage researchers agree that Scobell was a real person. Because of that consensus, this was the reality I chose to embrace in writing In Freedom's Shadow. In fact, it was one of my primary motivations in completing the book. So I'll share a little story to give you some insight into that. Not long after I set out to write this book, my son Jake, who's also an author, and I were driving home from a party, and we were talking about potential plot ideas and the overall story. And Jake suddenly just interrupted me in the middle of a sentence. And he said, "Dad, you need to write this story." And my response was, of course, yes, I do need to write the story. That's what we're talking about. That's why we're discussing it. And he said, no, you don't get it. I mean, you have to tell Scobell's story. He was a real American hero, and people have forgotten about. And then he added something to that that really stuck with me. And he said, it's been more than 150 years. People don't remember who he is. You have to give him his voice again. And really, that became my goal, became really the driving force in completing the book and getting that story out there. I really wanted to and never forgot the idea of trying to give John Scobell his voice again. So with that thought in mind, I will leave everybody with a bit of a mystery. The question, the riddle, if you will, is this a photo of John Scobell? Now, the photo is Pinkerton's men at a field encampment during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. This is Pinkerton here in the background. If memory serves, this is George Bangs, who's his secretary, seated here. I've seen research that identifies most, if not all, of the other Pinkerton operatives in the photo. But this gentleman right here is not identified. He's obviously not a servant, since he's eating dinner at the same table with the other Pinkerton agents. But to the best of my knowledge, nobody has ever been able to determine who he is. Could it be John Scobell? Is that the reason why this specific photo was taken? We will most likely never know. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you again, Antigone, for inviting me to talk today about Civil War spies and specifically about John Scobell. And thanks especially to those of you who tuned in to watch and listen. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you find that we have, in fact, been able to give John Scobell his voice again.
I loved the book personally. When I read it, as I wrote to you earlier, you kept me awake for 2 nights because the writing is so good. How did you happen to choose a fictional approach to this story instead of making it a history book?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind words. I appreciate that. The answer to that question is sort of embedded in what I talked about in the slide presentation, where everything that we know about Scobell is derived from what Pinkerton wrote about him in The Spy of the Rebellion. And initially, when I first started researching it, my original thought was that I would do a nonfiction book. But when I found that everything, all roads led back to Pinkerton's story, and that had been, as I pointed out, ground that had been plowed a couple times already in sort of re-reporting what Pinkerton wrote about, I decided to take the different approach of writing a novel about Scobell instead. The idea being to take what we did know as kind of the bones of the story and then put some meat on those bones. And in a lot of ways, what I attempted to do was not just fictionalize or certainly not sensationalize Scobell's story. Frankly, it's impressive enough. It didn't need to be sensationalized in any way, but to take other events that were going on at that time. And I'll take this opportunity to criticize Pinkerton one more time in his writing. He really, his story was self-contained. It almost didn't reference, to the point of confusion, things that were going on at the same time, where you're scratching your head saying, why didn't he write about this? So I took the opposite approach there and tried to integrate it in with other things that we knew were happening in that first 18 months or so of the war. Use that to put some meat on the bones and tell Scobell's story in a more in a broader way.
Well, I have to tell you, you were immensely successful. When I picked up the book and started writing on the first chapter, you describe his escape from slavery, trying to cross the river when he finally gets far enough north that he can go across the water, and he can't swim. Suddenly, I was feeling his fear, him trying to get across on a couple of logs. He has no equipment, no rope to tie the logs together, and he's terrified that if he goes down, falls off the log, all of a sudden, I wasn't reading a bunch of facts. I was engrossed in the person and his feelings and his moods. And I realized how effective that was as a technique, because yes, that probably did happen. And his conversations with other spies, I was intrigued by the way that he would change his walk, his mannerisms, when he is pretending to be a slave, that he is walking slowly, looking down at his feet and shuffling. And then when he goes around the corner and returns to being back to himself again, he can pick up his feet and start moving. When you said you wanted to give him his voice, you absolutely did, with examples like that, illustrating how he was working as a spy. It was amazing. So I commend the book to everybody. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, well, I will put up a picture of the book and suggest that people can purchase it on Amazon or wherever they like to buy their books. It is new, it is still out in the bookstores, and it is well worth a read.